Hey guys, so I have a not so spooky, kind of Halloweeny watercolor tutorial for you guys today. Today we are going to be using monochrome, just one color of paint and maybe one tube of gouache to paint this ink cap mushroom girl. I'm really excited to share this with you guys. I love how it turned out, and this is going to be a start to finish tutorial. So I'm going to be walking you through the sketching, inking, and painting parts of my watercolor process today. Now, before we really dive in, I want to kind of talk about a part of the process that I didn't really show you guys, and that was ideation. I had an idea in my mind. Originally, she was going to be Victorian inspired or Edwardian inspired, and with this long full dress, and I just could not make it gel. So then I decided to kind of switch gears and go towards 1920s fashion, and that's where I found my inspiration. So I'm flipping through my Canson XL watercolor sketchbook to find a clean page. Over to the left, I have a large thumbnail sketch of my basic idea. It's just kind of a rough idea of what I'm looking for. And I'm going to lightly start sketching it into my sketchbook using Pentel Red Lead. To start, I did a crosshairs to find the center of the page because this is going to be kind of a central composition where she's going to be the main focus. And I also am kind of referencing a few different poses from the 1920s to kind of capture that vibe, as well as a few different outfits to capture that vibe. So I'm not working from necessarily any one photo or any one outfit, but rather an amalgamation of several aspects that I happen to like and thought would really serve this piece. For this part of the sketching process, I'm trying to keep everything really light and only starting to work a little heavier once I have aspects that I like and that I want to solidify. While red lead is erasable, if you bear down too hard on the paper, it can cut into the paper and be impossible to erase. So I would really recommend kind of holding your pencil off to the side, sketching as lightly as possible until you have it down. And then if you want to sketch heavier to finalize it, you can. I'm going to do that because I need it to show up on camera. I know it's really hard to see what I have here, and this is kind of a compromise between. So normally I would do a lot of my sketching digitally and just not share that part. So this is kind of a compromise between the two. Once I've got everything kind of basically sketched in and kind of placed, I can move my sketchbook with my thumbnail sketch out of the way, and we can kind of focus on, figuring things out, solidifying things. I wanted her to have, it was either going to be a veil or a hat, or her hair would be the really drippy part of the ink cap mushroom. But I wanted to bring elements of the ink cap into her entire outfit. So she's also got gloves, and she's got a kind of shawl or like a capelet on her dress. And I decided to go for a longer dress for this one because the 1920s isn't just flappers. There's a variety of styles and a variety of periods. And I wasn't really, although the fringe for a flapper would have been kind of a cute idea for this, and fringes weren't even ubiquitous. I think Maya Rudolph has some really good videos on like 1920s fashion. If you're interested in learning more about fashion so that you can bring it more into your work. I'm pretty interested in just various historical fashions and clothing making techniques, and I do try to work them into my work. So that was definitely something I was kind of thinking of when I was working on the sketch for this. She also has kind of a sash style low belt. So it's not belted at her waist, it's belted lower. And she's got a transparent overdress with a little bit of beading or fringe down at the bottom. So a little of those fringe elements, but not a lot. I'm also heavily referencing several different photos of ink or inky cap mushrooms. These are actually an edible mushroom. So while she looks a little Halloween creepy, she's actually quite friendly and maybe not approachable, but she sure would like for people to approach her. So that was kind of the idea that I was going for. Somebody who looks sinister, but is actually rather kind. So that's why she has kind of a smile on her face, and her body language in general isn't necessarily meant to come across as, it might be a little creepy, but not necessarily as menacing. I was trying to bring all of that into this illustration here. I'm also going to sketch in the moss that kind of ties together my Mushroom Girl series. Next, I'm inking with something that's going to be waterproof. I'm using a Sakura Pigma FB brush pen. These are waterproof and alcohol marker proof. I have used them throughout the start to finish series. And one of my big selling points for these is if you get comfortable with using brush pens for your line art, then you don't need 20 different microns. You don't need a bunch of fine liners. You really just need the one, maybe even two brush pens. And brush pens come in a variety of different colors. While Sakura Pigma is only available in black, Tombow makes their Furunosuke line that I've shared and talked about and reviewed here on the channel, and it's available in a bunch of different colors if you are a fan of colored line arts, and those are also both waterproof and alcohol marker proof. But if you're inking along at home, a good rule of thumb is if you're using something that has an acrylic or an alcohol sort of base, or a pigment base in general, so some fountain pen inks, it's going to be waterproof. If you are using something with a water base like Marvy Le Pen's, it's going to be alcohol proof. That's why it's kind of important to me to find stuff that is both alcohol and waterproof. Just easier for me. I don't have to think about it as much. If you are one of my patrons over on Patreon and you don't feel like sketching and inking today and you'd just like to print this out and color it along, or you'd like to print it out and share it with somebody else so they can color along, maybe a kid in your life or just somebody who enjoys coloring, you can find this printable line art over on my Patreon at patreon.com/NatoSoup. My patrons support not only helps me continue to do what I do here on the channel, because it's not like I make a full-time living doing this, although I do put in full-time work, but they get early access to tutorials, to reviews, and they also get access to the materials that I generate for my classes that I don't share publicly, as well as printable line arts like this one that I also don't share publicly. So if you like what I do and you want to help me continue to do it, you can join me at patreon.com/NatoSoup. So I have done a lot of inking tutorials in the past, specifically inking with brush pens, because this is something that I would like to see more people doing and more people championing. And I'm not going to go super into my inking process today, but I do want to cover a few basics. I am using a white scrap of copy paper. You guys see that here. It's covering up my line art. This is a blotter sheet. It is to protect me from smearing the ink all over the place while it's still wet. It kind of blots up that still wet ink so it won't smear. It also protects the paper from any potential oils on my hands, because as humans, we do produce oils, and those can be a resist if you're trying to paint on top of them. So it's important to protect the paper from that. And it's also protecting me from smearing the red lead all over the place. I started with the most important thing, so her face and her mushroom cap and her hair for this one. So I started with that while my hand was still fresh. I have a comfort grip. I had a comfort grip on my pencil. I also have one on my pen. And as we progress, you're going to see that I have a lot of like bandages or grips on my brushes as well. I highly recommend, if there is one thing you take from this today, that you make accommodations for your hand health and for your hand health's longevity as early as possible. And if that means putting nice squishy comfy grips on your pencils, please do so. I have a video where I talk about my favorite grips. I talk about how they worked for me, and I have links where you can find your own if you want to get some. And that was kind of backed up by my occupational therapist. A lot of what I had learned in occupational and PT therapy, I brought into that video to try to help other artists who may not be able to afford occupational therapy take those little minor steps to improving their hand health. I don't talk about stretches or anything that might be more personalized. It's really just grips, because I'd asked on Threads for advice and nobody had any for me. So I decided to pay it forward and share that information out there. So I will link that for you guys down in the description below. But I highly recommend that you put a grip on your pencil, on your pen, on your stylus, on anything that you use regularly to draw or to write or to create art with. So I started with the most important focal point, her face. Then I started inking the mushrooms that overlap. So from foreground to background, kind of skipped over here to finish up her figure. And then I'm going to work on inking her mushrooms. And part of the reason for this process is, as we're inking, we are fatiguing our hand, we're straining those fine motor muscles. So it's important to warm up a little bit for sure. And I did that while sketching this. I actually sketched it and inked it in the same night. So it's important to warm up those motor muscles and also take breaks. I did take a break in between the two to not overstrain my hand. But you don't want to push yourself too hard. And the more you ink, the more work you put into your hand, the harder it can be to control those line work, the harder it can be to control those tremors. So you want to save the important things, or you want to do the important things while your hand's still fresh and while you still have that limberness and that dexterity. And for the things that are going to be less noticeable if you make a mistake or it's easier to correct, like with these mushrooms, that's when you can kind of go in after you've been inking for a while. I would recommend that you take breaks if you are tired. Take breaks if you need to. This does not have to be done all in one sitting or all in one night. Please don't think that. I will point out that this video has been time-lapsed 8x just for time's sake so that y'all are not watching a 4-hour video. But I did take breaks and I did step away from things, and with the inks I actually allowed them to dry completely overnight to cure to the paper before I added watercolor on top of them. So traditional art requires breaks just for the art itself. Please use those breaks to rest yourself and to take breaks and to work on the other things that you need to work on. I know a lot of you guys are parents or people who work full-time jobs, and dedicating yourself to art is a challenge, and there's time constraints and there's space constraints. So I'm trying to work on tutorials that can work with you guys, that you guys can work into your daily lives, because I feel like everyone should be able to make art a habit. Art is such a wonderful, enriching thing. I want everyone to be able to have it, and it shouldn't just be the domain of kids and teens. So my line art is finished. Now I'm going to start painting. I am using Daniel Smith's lamp black for this. I swatched a couple of different watercolors to see what I would like, and this is the one that I would like. Feel free to use whatever black you like to use for this. You can also use ink if you so desire, but I find that watercolor actually makes an excellent substitute for ink wash. I am also using a small ceramic palette with multi-wells, and I am going to be swatching, although you may not see me swatching as much because I want to see what those colors look like. I might do it off camera though, just for the sake of time. So I'm starting with one of my lighter values, and I am starting with the skin. I'm going to try out a few different camera angles here, and sometimes they are not going to work, like this instance here where I'm trying to fill in the ink cap mushrooms to her left. Trying out new things. Sometimes you're going to make mistakes, much like with art, videography, and camera work. You can make mistakes, and sometimes you only realize what a mistake that is when you're editing it, as I am doing now. So this is a cellulose watercolor paper, which means the paint, the water, they're going to sit on the surface of the paper. They're not going to soak in, which means that they can have faster dry times, which can be a great thing. But it also, some people struggle to paint on cellulose papers. It's called student grade paper. I don't really love that designation because it can be challenging to paint with. So one of the things that I want to kind of start doing now is I am kind of developing some of those darker colors with our ink wash. So that's one, not ink wash, our monochrome, our watercolor monochrome. I am probably going to refer to it as ink wash. It is not ink, it is watercolor, but it has the same effect as ink wash. And if you're a comic artist and you struggle to do ink wash, using watercolor for your ink wash could be a great solution. So I'm just kind of building up my tones and my colors very simply. This is a great one if you like watercolor and you like the look of watercolor, but you're struggling with all those colors and you're struggling with color mixing and you have decision fatigue and you just can't get those colors right. Because this utilizes a lot of the basic techniques like layering. That's what we're doing right now. We're building up that skin tone and we're building up some of those base colors, but it is so forgiving. You can very easily adjust your color and your saturation. So at this point, I'm doing some wet into wet where I have a more saturated mix of our black. So I have that really desaturated, really watered down mix. And then I have like that pate of wet paint that I put in another well. So when I want this kind of really saturated color to go wet into wet, I'm just gonna try to grab a little from the pate straight from the tube. I apologize for the blurriness, but you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. I have a more saturated pate of color where I add a little bit of water to kind of get what I'm looking for. This is great for like the really more saturated tones. And then I have the really watery, desaturated, super light gray that I use for the skin tone, or that I'm using for anything that isn't the stark white of the paper at this point in time. Mushrooms provide an excellent opportunity to demonstrate the technique I'm talking about. We're going to apply that really watery wash first, and then while it's still wet, so we're working mushroom to mushroom, and sometimes we're working in small segments, I'm going to dab in that more saturated color, starting where I first applied the water, so where the water line would meet the paper. So I didn't actually fill the whole mushroom in, as you can see on this one. And about halfway through, I'm adding in our black, and then I'm blending it out at the top, and then I'm adding more saturated black at the bottom, and that's giving us this really striking gradient effect. That's kind of the two main techniques for this tutorial. We have layering going on, where we're gently building up those layers of color so we can get kind of like a 1920s black and white film sort of thing going on. And then we're doing a lot of wet into wet so we can get the soft, inky gradient of the ink cap mushrooms. Basically, if you have these two techniques, it is basically rinse and repeat. We're going to be slowly building up our color by mixing in a little bit more black, a little bit more black. We're also going to be building up that color by layering it. So if you want a more striking transition, you would mix in some black to make it a darker wash like you see here. And if you want a gentler transition, you would just layer the black on top of it. That's what makes this so easy. It's really just a study in contrast, and these kind of contrast studies and these kind of contrast exercises can help improve your watercolor, because it kind of takes thinking about color out of the equation. You don't have to worry about color. You don't have to worry about color mixing. All you have to do is focus on that contrast. And the thing about this too is the contrast makes or breaks it. If there isn't enough contrast, it's not like color is going to save you. So some people really struggle with monochrome. Monochrome has been a kind of a struggle for me in the past, and I enjoy doing it, but it's definitely good to go back and revisit it, especially because so much of my work is full color these days, from my comic pages to the illustrations that I share with you guys, that it's good to go back to these kind of basics. And this is also a really fun, atmospheric, kind of moody, Halloween-y sort of exercise that we can do. So it's perfect for this time of year. And I know a lot of folks were doing inked art challenges, whether you are choosing to participate in Inktober or doing your own like I'm doing, and having this tutorial, learning how to do ink wash or faux ink wash, can be a really helpful option in your inking arsenal. I do have some other ink wash and watercolor ink wash tutorials that I've done here on the channel over the years. I'll try to remember to link those for you guys in case I offer some alternatives that I didn't cover here. One of the things that you want to keep in mind for something like this, right? I saved doing the background until I'd like blocked in her color, and that was because I wasn't sure about the contrast, and I wanted to make sure that the background didn't compete too much or distract too much from her or the mushrooms. And I hadn't decided yet if I wanted to do a light color background or if I wanted to do a dark colored background. I kind of had been leaning towards dark because it would be more Halloween and more moody and a little more spooky, but I didn't know if that would ruin the piece. So I decided to block her and the mushrooms in and then kind of decide from there. And the same kind of goes for the moss, just kind of building it up, as well as her stockings, and trying to create kind of the transparency effect with the overlay on the dress so that you can see her legs and the stockings underneath it. You can see how I'm kind of handling the wet black paint. We have our little splot of it, and then off to the side, I've started adding in water and using the corner of my ceramic palette to help me mix it. And this is just a really easy technique, but I think some people aren't necessarily aware of it, so I wanted to point it out. That's one of the reasons I often have these pulled out shots so you can actually see what I'm doing when I'm mixing color or how I'm utilizing the palette in case it's helpful for you. So contrast wise, everything is kind of samey with the mid-tone. So I want to go back in with more saturated black and kind of darken things up. So one of the things about painting in monochrome is you want to make sure that you really get that contrast in there. You really get those light lights and those dark darks, that you have a full gamut and that everything isn't just hovering in the mid-tone. So don't be afraid to get really saturated with your paint. I'm going to be using white gouache so there are areas that I have reserved as lighter, but for like those tippy top white highlights, I'm going to use white gouache to kind of pull those back in. Now, since we're painting ink cap mushrooms, you want to make sure you really get inky with the mushroom cap. So I am applying some black and then gently blending it back out. So I really want that contrast of like the almost white of the top of the cap that hasn't been bruised and hasn't started to leak inky looking liquid yet, and the bruised, darker, drippy parts of the mushroom. So here is a pretty dark, pretty saturated application of our lamp black, then blending it out with some clean water at the top to lighten it up, and then going back in to the drippy drips and kind of darkening that up, leaving a little bit of unpainted rim lighting area in the lighter colors just for that highlight. And I'm going to go back later on with the white gouache and kind of add in some, because if you look at ink cap mushrooms, the oozy drippy part that's starting to kind of melt is pretty shiny, and I definitely want to reflect that in what I'm painting here. When I'm painting a fairly simple monochromatic illustration like this one with a fairly simple main central figure, and as well as like some very obvious themes like the ink cap mushrooms, what I like to do is I like to hit those absolute highlights, the white of the paper, and then the very brightest midtones, and then start working darker from there. But if I was painting a nighttime scene, I might approach this very differently. So basically, I'm trying to think about what I want to accomplish with this, what I want to stand out, where I want the most contrast to be, and just kind of start working around and working towards that goal. Way early on, I'd put some masking fluid on the pearls so that way I didn't have to paint around all these little individual pearls and they would stand out as white against the darker background. I've gone ahead and I've removed that masking fluid, which that might have been a little bit prematurely because now I'm actually going back into that mushroom and kind of adjusting the contrast and painting it a little bit darker. But if you're painting along at home, you can learn from my mistake and you can choose a little bit otherwise. It's really just a time-saving measure so that I'm not like fiddly painting around little tiny things. You can also go back with white gouache and just kind of re-add those highlights too. Speaking of white gouache, I went and changed out my water. So I'm fixing the background right now. There's like some little areas that I had noticed after taking a break that I just was like, oh, this cannot stand. This is going to bother me. So I'm adjusting those and I'm kind of blending them into the background so it's less noticeable that I extended the background just a little bit because it was a little not as rounded on the right side as I probably would have liked. So because we're working in monochrome and we're working from light to dark, clean water is not as much of a priority as it would be if we were doing a lot of color mixing and working with a lot of other colors. But before you pull out that white gouache, you definitely want to change out your water, clean out your brushes so that you're not just painting more gray on the paper. Now, one of the things I noticed in the reference photos of ink cap mushrooms is that they have almost like this lacy white filament, even in the darker areas. And I really wanted to try to capture that with the white gouache. I probably should have used a stiffer bristle watercolor brush than these kind of floppy squirrel brushes that I have, because they tend to hold too much water. Because what ended up happening is it ended up a little more gray than I really wanted. And I really wanted that like really bright high white. But if you work with a stiffer brush and with less water, you should be able to achieve the white that I'm kind of going for with this. This point with adding white gouache, it's really just a matter of taste. What are you looking for? Do you want to add in kind of like a fringe at the bottom? Do you want to add a highlight on the shoes? Do you want to add some highlight back into the moss? Do you want to add in those white filaments? Do you want to add like a highlight on the lips? That sort of thing. You can also go back in with some more black and just kind of tighten things up if you want to add in some more darker shadows, kind of rebalance the contrast. This is one that you're not going to need to re-ink because we worked in black and white, so it's pretty straightforward. And it's also going to be one that might be a little easier to photograph or to scan because we're working with such a limited color gamut. You can still see some of my red lead through the monochrome. I'm good with that. That's something I'm gonna leave. I kind of like the ghostly red that it leaves, but it's really up to you. So what do you think of painting in monochrome? Does this seem like a technique that might be useful in helping you level up your watercolor skills, or maybe even painting some watercolors while you're still learning watercolor? Let me know down in the comments. I have a whole series of mini tutorials coming up where I walk you guys through some of my favorite watercolor tricks and techniques. I hope you guys will keep an eye out for that. If you are new here, or even if you're old here, it would be a huge favor if you would make sure that you're subscribed and also click that bell notification so that YouTube will let you know when I update. I also post when I have shared new videos over on Threads, Blue Sky, the community tab, Facebook, and even Twitter still. So if you want to make sure you never miss an update and you don't really trust YouTube to let you know, make sure you're following me over on those. If you want more of my art, you can find my comic at 7inchkara.com. It's free to read as a webcomic, and I would love to know what you think of it. And we have completed another start to finish watercolor tutorial. Thank you guys so much for joining me. It is thanks to my amazing patrons that I can make tutorials like this possible. So if you like what I do and you want to support it, you can join me at patreon.com/natosoup. I have a whole playlist of start to finish tutorials that I hope you guys will check out, and I hope to see you guys again soon.